The look of your backgrounds will dramatically affect the way your audience experiences your animation. So, in this module, I'm going to walk you through the basic steps that I take when creating the backgrounds for my animations. Let's start off with perspective. We all exist within a three-dimensional world where we can go up and down, left and right, forward and back. However, our drawings are only able to use two of these dimensions, left and right, and up and down. When it comes to drawing, there is no forward and back. So it's up to you to create that illusion in your drawings. Otherwise, your backgrounds will seem flat and unbelievable. But exactly how do you go about creating backgrounds that appear to have that all-important third dimension of distance? Well, you do it by creating perspective in your scene. The use of perspective is fundamental to the success and believability of your cartoons. By learning just a little bit about perspective and applying it in your drawing, you'll be able to take your animations to a whole new level. But this is not a class on how to draw pretty pictures with perfect perspective. This is an animation course. So I'm not going to get into an in-depth discussion about three-point perspective, vanishing points, or POVs. Instead, I'm just going to make sure that you understand one very important principle, and that is the principle of distance. The primary rule of perspective is this: the closer something is to you, the larger it appears, and the farther away something is, the smaller it appears. Even in the real world, our perception of distance is based upon this illusion. For example, when you watch a car drive down the street in your direction, you know the car isn't growing, it's just getting closer, and therefore seems to be getting bigger and bigger. Therefore, if you want to create the illusion of depth in your backgrounds, you simply need to draw things smaller the farther they go into the background. Now I know that I'm way oversimplifying the idea of perspective, but the truth is, it would be a waste of time for me to explain all the intricate details of how perspective works, especially since the work has already been done for me, and because it's explained in a far superior way to what I could ever do. So, if you want to go really deep and learn exactly how to use perspective, there is a link below this video which will take you to the most in-depth training about perspective that I have ever come across. Now that we understand the basic principle of perspective, let's talk about the horizon line. The horizon line is a straight horizontal line across the screen that represents the viewer's eye level. We take our visual cues for every object that we are looking at from the horizon line. Its placement will determine whether you are looking up, down, or straight across the environment. There are two rules that come along with having a horizon line. Anything above or taller than the viewer will be above the horizon line, and anything shorter or below the viewer will be below the horizon line. When you place the horizon line down near the bottom of the screen, you'll be looking up to just about everything. This is called a worm's eye view. If the horizon line is up near the top of the screen, you'll be looking down on pretty much everything, and this is called a bird's eye view. Nothing complicated or groundbreaking here. All you have to do is draw one line and then follow the two rules. Simple. So once you've established your horizon line, the second step in creating your background is drawing the ground plane. The ground plane is simply a grid that represents the distance and shape of the ground. For example, let's imagine for a second that the ground is perfectly straight. The ground plane might look something like this. Notice that the horizontal lines become more closely spaced the closer they get to the horizon line. This is a representation of the main rule of perspective, which is the farther something gets from you, the smaller it appears, and the closer it gets, the larger it appears. Also, notice that since the ground is perfectly flat, it stops at the horizon line. If it went above the horizon line, it would show that the ground was sloping upward, because as we mentioned before, anything that is above the horizon line is taller or farther up than the viewer. So, we now know how to create a basic flat ground plane. But the ground is rarely perfectly flat, so what if we want to create a background that involves hills, mountains, or gullies? For scenes like that, you will need to display the contours of the earth using the grid to show the ups and downs, like this. Notice that the ground plane I drew isn't very accurate. The spacing is far from perfect. This is because I don't waste my time creating perfectly spaced ground planes, and neither should you. The ground plane is just there to give you an idea of distance and ground shape. Anything more than that is overkill and most likely a waste of time. So don't worry about getting it perfect. Just sketch it out so that it gives the general idea of what you want. So, we've now created ourselves a nice ground plane. The next step is to sketch out any stationary items that will make up the background, such as trees, bushes, rivers, rocks, the sun, the moon, distant mountains, clouds, flowers, rocket ships, dead cows, a sword in the stone, ancient castles, new castles, phone booths, nuclear warheads, or pretty much whatever you want, really. Sometimes it's a good idea to create a foreground for your animation, too. A foreground is essentially a part of the background that is closer to the camera than the action that will be taking place in the scene. Let's take the scene from the previous example, minus a few unnecessary items. The foreground could consist of some trees like this, maybe add a little grass, and even a flower or two. Adding a foreground to your scene can help make the audience feel like they are actually in and part of the world you are creating, and can be used to create some really in-depth scenes. It's also important to note that you're not limited to using only one background and one foreground. You can have as many as you want, but typically one of each will do the trick. Now that we've finished sketching our background, it's time to add color. The colors that you choose will have a massive effect on the final outcome of your animation. Now, right about now, you might be thinking that I'm partially retarded, because obviously it makes a difference whether the monkey is brown or whether it's blue. But stick with me for a sec, because there is actually more to choosing colors than you may think. Every color is comprised of 3 different parts. The 3 parts are called hue, saturation, and brightness. The first part you need to know about is called hue. Hue controls what you might normally refer to as color. In other words, by changing the hue, you can change the color to be more red, more green, or more blue, and any color in between. The next part of color is saturation. Saturation controls how powerful the color is. So the higher the saturation, the more the color will stand out, but the lower the saturation, the more dull the color becomes. It's important to note that humans are not accustomed to seeing a lot of high saturation colors, so it's a really good idea to keep the majority of your colors in your animations at lower saturation levels. That doesn't mean that you never want to use high saturation. It just means that you should save it for special occasions. And no, not like your birthday, like when you want something to stand out. Here are a few rules of thumb that you can use to decide when it's appropriate to use high saturation colors. Number 1. The farther an item is from the camera, the less saturated it will appear, but the closer it is, the more saturated it will appear. When you want something to stand out from the scene, you might want to up the saturation a little. Also, when something is wet or shiny, it will oftentimes appear more saturated than if it wasn't wet or shiny. The third part of color is brightness, which pretty much explains itself. The higher the number, the more the color seems to be mixed with white. The lower the number, the more black gets mixed in, and the darker the color becomes. If an item is subjected to a lot of light from the sun, then its brightness would go up, whereas if an item is in the shade, its brightness would go down. So, now that you understand the 3 parts of color, let's go ahead and add a little color to our background. Now typically I would wait to color the backgrounds until after I've animated the scenes. The reason for this is because if I need to change anything in the background to accommodate the action in the scene, it'll be a lot easier to do that if the scene isn't already colored, and then I won't waste all the work I've put into coloring the scene. But I'm just going to go ahead and show you how to color the background, and then when you're making your own animation, you can just wait to color the background until after you've animated the scene.